America is increasingly finding itself at the mercy of a ruling class. An unholy but holier than thou alliance of progressive legislators, the legacy media, and woke corporate interests. So, how do we break the ruling class's monopoly? Joining me now to discuss this further is the CEO of American Majority, an exceptional writer and thinker, Ned Ryun. Ned, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Yeah, no, good to be with you, Ben.
So Ned, as I mentioned, we're facing an onslaught right now, and it starts with the first bills in the House and Senate, the deceptively named For the People Act, which of course would enshrine all of the election integrity eroding measures of the 2020 election, and also challenge federalism to boot. So the question is this legislation is the whole ballgame. How do you see ultimately, do you see Senate Republicans fighting this? And what should our takeaway be from the fact that this is the very first bill that comes out of this new Congress?
No, I think you make a point. It's a very Orwellian title, For the People Act, but I, in fact, call it codifying corruption. I mean, let's not forget, this was Nancy Pelosi's H.R. 1 in the last session of Congress. Although that version was only 550 pages, they've learned a little bit after the 2020 elections, added another 250 pages to this edition of it. But it is nothing less, Ben, than the codifying of corruption that we saw last election in the 2020 presidential election, in which ballot harvesting becomes legal. They turn election day into election week. States now have to accept ballots 10 days after election. It really is. It's nothing less, Ben, if you were to actually encapsulate into one sense, it's nothing less than taking away the right of self-governance from the American people, because Democrats have decided they're tired of being told no, not only by Republicans, but by the voters as well. And so really, if you want to look at an overarching theme, they really want to take all 50 states, California, and apply it to all 50 states. So that's one party rule. And they realize if they can somehow get this passed, and I got to tell you, not terribly optimistic when your backstop Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in the Senate to make sure they don't go nuclear, remove the legislative filibuster to shove this down their throats. It's a troubling time that we're in, because if we don't win this, if we don't somehow manage to hold them off on this bill, it's going to be an ugly scenario. Obviously, it's going to go to the states. There are a lot of state attorney generals. Republicans are going to fight it. But still, the fact that it might pass the Senate is troubling, to say the least.
Yeah, and of course, if they have to nuke the filibuster in order to achieve it, then the floodgates are going to open on a whole raft of disastrous legislation. And I think it seems that Democrats do recognize the potential political suicide they could be engaged in there, but they've engaged in suicide missions before, and they still find ways to get back into power. One of the ways that they're trying to do it right now, and it's amazing how brazen this is in trying to unseat a duly elected Republican, as I mentioned in the opening, Marionette Miller Meeks, from Iowa, too. What do you make of this gambit from Nancy Pelosi? Is this an attempt to telegraph and create the precedent for ultimately unseating anyone Democrats don't like if they have a majority in the House?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a completely demented move, going back to where we've decided. A lot of people, though, and Ben, have decided that democracy is inconvenient in D.C. They've just decided, and not only Democrats, by the way, Republicans, a ruling class. The ruling class is not just Democrats. It's not just the corporate media. It's not just big tech. There are certain Republicans that obviously buy into this concept that they're part of a ruling class. They like the status quo. And they were very upset that Donald Trump somehow came in and kicked over the table and upended it all. So I think it is troubling that Nancy Pelosi, this lady was sworn in. Again, it was a very narrow vote. Six votes, I think, was the winning margin. But still, she was sworn in. She is an official sitting member of the U.S. House. And now they're deciding, because of the Biden administration, obviously a couple of the members of that Democratic House caucus have gone into that administration. Their margins are shrinking and shrinking. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we find another vote? I mean, this is troubling behavior in which they are overturning the will of the American people, specifically the voters in Iowa. And I know it was close, but at the same time, this was a certified election. She was sworn in. And it is troubling to see Nancy Pelosi try and get away with this. And of course, you know, the corporate media bootlickers are, of course, bolstering her efforts and not really covering it and not even questioning this. But I want to go back to something really quick on this whole thing with H.R. 1 and codifying the corruption. When you realize what is at stake, again, you alluded to this, it's not just H.R. 1, right? It's not political power for generations and generations. It's Green New Deal, right? It's the Equality Act. It's all of these things to re-engineer America into the regressive socialist vision. I mean, that's really what's at stake. And the linchpin is this H.R. 1. Boy, I got to tell you, Republicans had better toe the line. I certainly hope that Joe Manchin, especially, and Kyrsten Sinema, obviously toe the line and say we're not going to upend the filibuster, which, by the way, and I know that people have discussed this, Barack Obama didn't find this racist, the legislative filibuster, when he was in the Senate. But it is amazing to see how far the Democratic Party has come over the last 15 years. Now the filibuster is a racist relic of Jim Crow, which is, of course, a falsehood. But also, I want to remind people, back in 2005, Jimmy Carter's bipartisan commission actually advocated photo ID. And now the left, the Democrats, are saying that that is a tool of voter suppression. This is how far we've come in 15 years. And I really think what's at the heart of it, Ben, they got a real scare in 2016, obviously, when the great outsider was elected and upended a lot of things and actually didn't buy the premise of the administrative state. And now they're realizing we can't let that happen again. We've got to fortify these elections. That infamous quote out of that Time magazine article back in February, because, dear God, those dirty little peasants might not do what's best for them, i.e. for the ruling class, and might actually elect another outsider in 2024. We better make sure that never happens again. But this is troubling that H.R. 1 is such a linchpin for their socialist agenda for America. And it kind of gives me a little bit of hope, Ben. This is why Joe Manchin will not actually vote to remove the legislative filibuster, because he realizes if he does that, they will ram through the Green New Deal, which, of course, is devastating for his home state of West Virginia.